Hi, I'm Scott Hanselman. This is another episode of Hansel Minutes. Today I'm chatting with Kate Kalcevich. She's the head of accessibility innovation at Fable. Fable, in fact, does digital accessibility. It's powered by people with disabilities. Thank you so much for chatting with me today, Kate.
Thanks so much for having me, Scott.
So I took a look at the Fable website and learned about who uses Fable, the accessibility leadership in the space that you're working in. And I thought it was really interesting that on the homepage you hit right off the bat, powered by people with disabilities. You've even underlined the word people. This is a very people-centric website. That's the first impression I get when I look at the homepage for makeitfable.com.
Yeah, definitely. We have a community of people with disabilities who use assistive technology, and they're at the heart of how we do accessibility. So it's less about technology and technical standards and more about how humans are interacting with that technology and the barriers that they're facing.
That's really interesting because I have done accessibility work myself, but it was always very kind of, tool-centric. We were always thinking about what plugin I could plug into the browser, what app I could install in Windows that would just solve the problem. And I think as a person that does not need to use any assistive technology other than just bigger fonts, I'm all about zooming in on stuff. But for the most part, I don't even think of that as being an assistive technology. I'm realizing that I was not being very people-centric in my thinking about how I interact with the machine. I want tools. It sounds like I need to get my head right.
Well, a lot of people start that way. I worked in government for 2 decades, and we were very tool and technology centered as well. Especially in the early days, we didn't have access to people with disabilities. We didn't have access to users at all because I've been doing this for more than 20 years. So I started well before user research was really a popular thing to do. And so everything was tool centric. And tools are important as part of the process because it's not just about people. You've got a volume. Most of the teams that we work with are working on really large sites, multiple apps. And so tools can really help reduce some of the workload in accessibility. So they're an important part of the puzzle.
Yeah. I think it was about 20 years ago when I think it was Section 508, which was a law that indicated that banks and certain websites needed to be accessible. And they had some very basic measurements for that kind of stuff. And my company went and contracted with a group called the Associated Blind of New York, where they hired blind folks to basically use our website and then complain. That was my first interaction to the basics of human-focused and people-focused disability and accessibility.
Yeah, I had a similar interaction, but it was actually through Fable because before I worked for Fable, I was a customer of Fable. So that's it. That's really where it all started. And so I was working in government and we had a contract with Fable. They were a vendor of ours and we were using them to test our apps, our mobile apps and our web apps for accessibility. So that's where I really got into accessibility testing with people with disabilities.
So you were a customer and then you said, this is so cool, I want to join the company.
Yeah, actually, that's exactly what happened. It has been such a great change in my career direction. Obviously shifting from government to private sector is a big leap. And then just shifting from this really technically oriented kind of bureaucratic way of working to a much more rapid pace of change, more innovative way of working has been really, really almost feels like a second career for me.
That's cool. You were the digital accessibility lead at Canada Post. You worked for the Ontario Ministry, all throughout government. Was it always accessibility? I know you do UX work, but when did it go from being UX to being accessible UX for you?
Well, it didn't always start as accessibility. I was a web designer. This was the mid-90s when I really started building websites. So there wasn't even user experience back then. And I got into accessibility when I joined the government because similar to you, they introduced legislation about accessibility and that the government websites had to be made accessible. So that's when I really started thinking about it. But it was never the primary focus of my job at the beginning. I was always just a practitioner, a designer, a front-end developer. And then I had learned so much about accessibility along the way that I started teaching others about it. And then eventually it just became a leadership thing and a teaching thing and just sharing the knowledge and trying to really multiply the impact that I could have.
So when you think about multiplying impact, there's 8 billion people on the planet. When I was researching this, there are a billion people, quote unquote, with disabilities. That's a lot. 1 in 8 is a huge number. And a lot of these are invisible disabilities. You can't tell. I can't detect it in their browser when they show up, and I can't detect it when I look at someone. But 1 in 8 is a big number.
It is. And in some cases, it's a higher number, depending on which region you're in. I know in Ontario, Canada, where I am, it's closer to 1 in 4. And it depends on how you measure disability too, depending on how the surveys are done and what questions you're asking. Certain governments consider some things to be a disability and other things not. And so that can change how the numbers work. But it's a much bigger number than people think.
Yeah, that got me thinking, because on paper, when I'm filling out forms, as a type 1 diabetic of nearly 30 years, I am disabled. But other than, again, just using accessibility tools to zoom and improve my vision, I feel a little bit of like, I don't know if the word is like disability, low self-esteem, like I shouldn't, or imposter syndrome, like I'm not disabled until I really need some orange juice. And then I'm, sitting on the side of the road disabled, but I don't want to claim that because I am able-bodied and able to stand and move around.
I hear that a lot, especially from people with invisible disabilities. Even myself, so I identify as disabled. I wear hearing aids in both of my ears. They're really small, even turning my head a bit to the side, and you really can't see them. They're in my ear canal. And I've worn them since I was 6 years old. Growing up, I wasn't really treated differently, except being in speech therapy, because I got my hearing aids so late. I had to learn how to speak without what we call a deaf accent. So lots of working on a lisp and stuff like that. And so I didn't really hang out with other people with disabilities. There weren't very many in my school. So I never really identified as disabled either, even though I do have a moderate to severe hearing loss. So it's quite common. And I think because I talk about my disability so much as part of my job and just doing a lot of public speaking, people are more open with me about that. So I heard that story a lot, that I don't really identify as disabled. And, the one group that has the highest prevalence of disability is seniors. So it's 1 in 2 over the age of 65, but almost none of them identify as disabled. They just think I'm getting old, which they are, but they're also losing some of their function, their eyesight, their hearing, their mobility. And so that counts as disability.
That is really, really interesting, because I just turned 50 last week. For those who can't see me, I'm wearing readers now, so I have to wear, reading glasses full time. I mentioned before that I do zoom in, and diabetes is the leading cause of blindness, and I've had eye surgery, but I do chalk that up to just getting older. But then to your definition, that would mean that we are all going to be disabled if we simply wait long enough.
Yeah, definitely. And not only do we all age into disability, but there's also instances of temporary disability. You break your arm, or maybe you have like laser eye surgery, and there's a while where you're wearing these glasses and everything's blurry. And then there's situational limitations. So even if you're not disabled, things like accessibility can benefit folks. One of the best examples, if you're ever outdoors and it's a sunny day and you're trying to check your cell phone and there's just so much glare, and if you don't have a really good contrast on the screen, you just can't see.
I'm trying to think about me feeling not disabled, while someone could be fully, completely blind or have tunnel vision, all the spectrum, the slider bar, to use a user interface analogy of disability. It would be really challenging to measure whether or not my website was an accessible website. And then if my boss calls me, the suit says, hey, make sure the website's accessible. That business person's level, it's a checkbox. Accessible, not accessible. And in reality, it's a slider bar, varying levels of accessible. Where would I even start to describe like a KPI, a key performance indicator here, if my boss just thinks about it as a Boolean?
Well, because to your earlier point, most people think of it in terms of legislation or legal compliance. That's where most people were introduced to accessibility. So people tend to think of accessibility as compliance with a set of standards. But to your point, it's really hard to measure that. You've got multiple websites, multiple products, multiple apps, and multiple screens and pages across all of them. To try to boil down accessibility into a yes, no is impossible. And if you do, nobody's ever going to be yes. There's no way to be perfectly accessible at all times, especially if you're continually updating and developing. You've got teams working on websites and apps constantly. They're going to miss something somewhere. So Anyone who tries to use this binary accessible, not accessible, it's just a false narrative that's not ever going to work. And the problem with that is it also doesn't tell you why a product is or isn't accessible and how accessible that product is or isn't, and if it's getting better or worse.
Doesn't that mean that I'm going to have to spend a lot of time like educating executive leadership, and they may not be interested in the granularity and the detail that I'm going to need to share with them?
Possibly. I mean, executive buy-in is really important for accessibility. It's really hard to do accessibility at a large organization as a grassroots initiative because you're not going to get the budget and the backing to do it. But I think the conversation, a lot of executives want to hear, what's the return on investment? But when you start thinking about those numbers that we talked about and how big the opportunity is, there's this huge market of people with disabilities. And they can be very loyal to companies that take their needs into account and make their digital products accessible. So being able to tap into that market. And there's also a human element. I find executives, once they see somebody struggling with interacting with their product, it really helps them to understand the problem and in a human, centered way as opposed to a numeric.
That right there, that moment of empathy, if you can get that to click in a boss's head or a leader's head, is so important. When we were trying to make our websites accessible for the blind, a lot of the engineers could intellectualize it, but it didn't click. So I was the chief architect at the time, and I asked a couple of them to use their laptops with the lid closed for a day. So they spent the day using JAWS and some of the screen readers, and after 4 or 5 hours, a lot of them became quite frustrated that they were not able to see what was going on the website. And that was when the empathy moment clicked.
Yeah. Sometimes people talk about that, trying to experience it for yourself, but the reality is you're never going to experience it the way a person who lives with a disability does. And sometimes when people try empathy exercises, it can go wrong because they start thinking they have to do things for accessibility that they don't actually have to do. People who use assistive technologies every day, they have ways of interacting with websites and content and using that assistive technology that's much more advanced than somebody who just turned on a screen reader for a day or even a couple of days. And so sometimes you got to be really careful with these empathy exercises. If you're not actually engaging with people with disabilities, you might be doing more work than you need to, doing the wrong work, or making something even less accessible, even though you're trying to make it more accessible.
Interesting. That is a really good kind of like checking me moment for me to think about whether that was a good idea. In the case of the example I just gave you, it convinced the engineers that they needed to engage with blind people. So that empathy exercise was not to force them to code, but rather to force them to engage with actual blind engineers that then came and helped us out, which I think worked out. But that's a really great point. Thank you for bringing that up. Something else I wanted to call out, that in talking to you before the show, remembering that this is an audio podcast, I asked if you had listened to the show before, and you indicated, well, no, I'm hearing impaired. I don't really listen to a lot of podcasts, but I do have transcripts. But then you pointed out that my transcripts were not immediately visible or available to me on the website, which is like, I'm very proud of our transcripts, but if they're not easy to find, then that sucks. All of those things are such great learning moments for me to understand how someone would interact with my content for the first time, because you arrived to the show and did not find it immediately accessible. So now I've got something to fix, which I think is a gift, and I thank you for that.
No, you're welcome. But I think, that's part of user experience and testing and making sure it works. And it's also, people with disability, they're busy like everybody else, so I will quickly look at something, and if it's not apparent to me right away, I will usually just use my own accommodations. So for example, in the Chrome browser, they have a setting where I can just have it automatically provide live captions for any audio and video. So I know where that is. It's on by default, and I just rely on that rather than figuring out for each particular website where the transcripts, or it's the same with fonts. You want to set your font size large on your operating system and just have everything be larger. You don't necessarily want to go to every website and try to look for like a little font setting and adjust it there.
That's a great point. Yeah, when you told me about that live captioning basically for the browser, and I know that like iPhones now and iPads have live captioning for the entire operating system. They're basically listening to the outputted audio, right? And captioning everything that they hear.
Yeah. And the automated captions aren't perfect. They do miss something. Because I'm not fully deaf, I can fill in the gaps with my hearing. I also lip read a bit. So between the three things, I can figure out what's being said. And everybody with a disability, even if they have the same disability, they might need different accommodations. Somebody who doesn't lip read can't rely on that, or somebody who maybe is a bit more hard of hearing than I am really does need the caption to be perfect. So even within disability, there's a spectrum of, needs that every person has as an individual, and building, websites, products, apps that are more flexible and can be customized to every person's need by respecting, the default, the standards, using, native approaches to coding, native technology. So for example, HTML, as opposed to trying to make components from scratch, will give you that flexibility.
Yeah, it's interesting. I felt educated and up on making accessible websites, making accessible media. But just the thing that clicked for me a few moments ago was that you are augmenting one thing, in this case, hearing, with three different individual tools, which is giving you lots of different ways. You can choose to interact with the captions, or choose to interact with watching lip reading, or turn up the volume or the gain on your hearing aids. But additionally, at Microsoft, where I work in my day job, we've added in our main events, our kind of like our first party giant events, a little picture in picture of American Sign Language. That is an optional secondary track, because captions are not just the solution. A lot of people who are hearing will say, oh yeah, just use captions, right? That's important as well, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. There's such a spectrum of disability and needs that people have. But I think sometimes that scares teams away. And it's important to understand that accessibility is a journey. You're not going to spend 6 months, do an accessibility project, and then be done. It is a continual way of working, and something that you're going to always have to do.
There is a section on the Fable website at makeitfable.com called the Accessible Usability Scale. It's basically a tool that gives a number about how accessible a product is after a user's had an experience. Is that something that we could incorporate into our KPIs when thinking about accessible experiences on a website or in a product?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Accessible Usability Scale, or the AUS as we call it for short, is a 10-question survey, and anyone can use it. You don't have to be a user of Fable to use it. You can take that survey and administer it at the end of a usability test with somebody who uses assistive technology, and then get that score. And if you were to get enough of those scores on your critical task flows within your product, you can average those out and try to get a sense of how accessible your product is from a user's perspective, as opposed to just focusing on the technical standards.
I appreciate that you call out the flow as well, because a lot of times I will see people declare victory on their homepage, but the shopping cart is a nightmare for an accessibility perspective, and scoring each individual kind of like hot path sounds like a best practice.
Yeah, I mean, in the old days of the web, everything was just plain text content. Everything was accessible by default. Once we started making things interactive is where accessibility really started to become a challenge. And it's through those interactions, like you said, search, adding something to a cart, going through the checkout, all the important things you need to do, perhaps booking an appointment with your doctor online. And if you don't have access to that, you're really limited in your ability to participate in society. So it's through those interactions that I think are the most important places to start thinking about accessibility.
Speaking of scheduling appointments and scheduling calls, through COVID, we saw this burst of video calls, and everything can be done remotely now. I remember flying to New York to interact with the blind engineers to work on our project. But through things like Fable and Fable Engage, am I to understand that I can basically have a virtual team of people with disabilities help me with my user research and with my development?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the beauty of it is, you're no longer stuck relying on these technical standards. If you have a lot of accessibility challenges, maybe you've used a tool or you've had an audit done and you have all these issues. If you actually interact with people, for example, through Fable Engage, you can try to figure out which things are priority and which things to fix first. Because oftentimes when you're looking at technical standards, the volume of accessibility barriers you find is so high, and that can be really hard to pick apart and understand, what do I action first? And so in those interactions with real people, you can start to understand, well, what's really the biggest challenge here? And what do we have to tackle first? Because again, it's a journey. You're not going to be able to fix everything all at once. It's about starting with, what are the biggest challenges? How do we fix those? Which teams are working on new things right now? How do they integrate accessibility into the work that they're doing?
It's such a clever business model. It's just one of those ideas that I'm like, that would a great idea to have a pool of testers with deep experience in a particular assistive technology that I can then engage on to improve specific aspects of my website or of my product. And these are basically experts both in their disability, because I know that I am an expert in my diabetes, as I'm sure you're an expert in your being hearing impaired, but we are only experts in our own self, because you said it's a spectrum, just as my disability is a spectrum and yours is as well. So we can engage with testers across the spectrum of disability. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. So the insights you're going to get from somebody who uses a screen reader versus the insights from somebody who uses screen magnification or somebody who's using an alternative navigation, they all have different challenges and barriers. And so through those interactions, you can start to understand, maybe your website works really well for people with low vision, but not at all for people who are fully blind. And that can help you prioritize and figure out, what you have to action first.
Yeah. And not just visual or auditory disabilities, but also, people with mechanical disabilities. You might find that a button on your page doesn't have the touch size large enough. And when someone's pressing it on an iPad, the spot is too small. I had shoulder surgery, and for a year, I couldn't move either of my arms above my shoulder. I had dual frozen shoulder. So I was very much like a T-Rex for about a year, and it completely changed how I interact with my computer. And I was finding, again, temporary, like you pointed out at the beginning of the call, this temporary disability fundamentally interchanged how I thought about my computer for that time.
Yeah. And so you could discover those kinds of things through those interactions with people with disability. The other thing we do is actually training. So to take it a bit back to KPIs, in order to successfully have an accessible product, you need people who are educated in accessibility.
Okay.
And you also need processes to support that accessibility work. And those processes can involve automated tools, and it can also be interacting with people with disabilities. In fact, it should probably be a bit of both. And so through training and education, you make sure your designers, your researchers, your developers, your QA tester, all the people who are building these products know enough about accessibility that they can build these more inclusive products. And partly that is understanding, what do I have to do? What do I have to do as a designer? What tool do I have to use? How do I have to change my design process in order to design a more inclusive product? And so it's that balance of, how do we measure how much people know about accessibility? How do we measure the processes that we're using and know if we're getting better at this? And then that'll support your product accessibility.
Right. And when I'm selling this to the boss, I always try to remind people that this is not just to be nice. It is literally so that you do not exclude people. Like, the whole point of inclusion is to avoid unnecessarily excluding folks from experiencing your product, your game, your mobile device. And if you were only targeting able-bodied people and 10% of them had a lousy experience, you would go to your user experience people and you'd say, we should fix that. But if you are targeting everyone and 10 or 20% of people are having a lousy experience because they are differently abled, we should probably fix that.
Yeah. The other thing people miss is that a lot of accessibility can be very innovative work. When you're looking at accessibility from a standards compliance angle, you're not being innovative. And in fact, most people don't like to do that type of work. But if you're thinking about it as co-designing with people with disability, getting feedback from people with disability, challenging the way you think about product design and development, that's where you can get inspiration and new ideas and find new ways of working and doing things. And that's what we all want. We want teams that are more innovative and more creative. And in engaging with people who are different from us, that's how we get that.
That's very cool. Yeah, I feel like it's a combination of, like you said, it's innovation, but then it's also the little things that we just needed a reminder about. You posted a little while back on LinkedIn about a survey that you did on mobile insights, and just not labeling a button, or not being able to resize text, or you disabling pinch to zoom. I hate it as someone who wants to Zoom when they disable pinch to zoom for no reason other than maybe aesthetics. And those things stand in the way. And you call out in your article, these are not hard things to fix. You just have to kind of remember.
Yeah, well, that's the beauty of working with people with disabilities is you start to realize that it's not complicated. You don't need to know hundreds of guidelines. You just need to know what's hard for people and how do I fix it.
Mm-hmm. I also wanted to congratulate you because I did see a press release go by where you were appointed to an accessibility standards committee in Canada with a focus on, on AI, making AI more accessible?
Yeah, accessible and equitable AI, which, is a really important thing. We've had AI for a lot longer than most people realize. I think everybody thinks of the latest chatbots and things that we do with AI, and it's been popular in the last year or so, but we've been using AI for a long time, and AI has been used to exclude people. One of the best examples of that is in the hiring process where, automated AI tools are trying to match job applicants with people who have previously been in that position. So they're trying to match what was historically a biased selection process. And so, if you're training an AI to look for people like the people already in the job and the people already in the job aren't diverse, you're just going to get more of the same. And so now that people are more aware of AI, I'm hoping that we can put in place guidelines and standards to make AI more inclusive than it's ever been.
That's great. I'm really glad that is being thought about, and congratulations on being appointed to that committee.
Thank you.
Do you also think, though, that by making things more accessible, like not to be too much of a capitalist here, but you are increasing the number of people that you can reach? Like by not excluding folks, you are making your business better. You're going to have more people that you can talk to.
Yeah, definitely. And I think sometimes people try to boil it down a little bit too much to the numbers, but they're there. The market reach is there when you start thinking about how many people have disability. And being able to include all those people in your service or product and offering, who wouldn't want that? When we think about gaming in particular, there's a ton of people with disabilities who love to do gaming, and there's no shortage of a pool of people to test gaming accessibility with because many gamers are actually disabled. It's quite an active community.
Yeah. 2023, frankly, was a kind of a golden year for video game accessibility, particularly in like AAA games. Like Dead Space called out their motor, visual, and auditory stuff as separate individual sections within accessibility. Forza Motorsport did some amazing stuff. Even Street Fighter got like an award of some kind for accessibility. And little things, like I always like making my text bigger or adding subtitles with a background text, contrast. It seems like the last 2 or 3 years, people started to care about accessibility in video games.
I think it's just becoming more apparent because companies are talking more about it. I think that's the thing that's really important is that people have worked on accessibility in the past more silently. And now you have companies doing, video ads about accessibility, about their adaptive controllers for video games and talking more publicly about it. And it's through that conversation, it's through being more public and more open about accessibility that we really start to move things forward.
Very cool. Well, I really appreciate you spending time with me today.
Thanks for having me. It's been a great conversation.
We have been chatting with Kate Kalcevich. She's the head of accessibility innovation at Fable. You can check them out at makeitfable.com. This has been another episode of Hansel Minutes, and we'll see you again next week.